tonight's speaker, who is going to introduce us to some wondrous cats. Dr. Megan Kassabaum is the Weingarten Assistant Curator in the American section of the Penn Museum and received her PhD in anthropology from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, with a dissertation entitled Feasting and Communal Ritual in the Lower Mississippi Valley, AD 700 to 1000. Dr. Kassabaum is involved in active fieldwork in the Mississippi Valley and contributed to the Mississippi Mound Trail project, which is now live online, I see. Last time I introduced her, it was just a gleam in the eye. So you can Google Mississippi Mound Trail, and you'll find that there's a linked series of 18 or so mound sites which are visible from public highways, and you can drive down through. I'm sure it's a very nice thing to do. Meg also excavated and did topographic mapping and wrote the final reports on all those sites, and that's just one part of a very extensive bibliography. Meg is very, very important both to the school and the museum for her teaching and research. She teaches in the Center for Analysis of Archaeological Materials and also in the Department of Anthropology, where she teaches archaeology at both introductory and advanced levels. She mentors lots of students, both at the graduate level and the undergraduate level. And finally, as if that's not enough, she has, over the last year or so, been working as the curator of a new exhibition, which is going to open on June the 24th in the Penn Museum, so mark your calendars, come back and see it. And that is entitled Mound Builders, Ancient Architects of North America. So, you can see for all these reasons why Megan is very highly valued by all of us. And as an unapologetic cat person, I am particularly pleased to be able to introduce her to you tonight to talk to you on underwater panthers and their place in Native American cosmos. Meg.
All right. Thank you so much for that introduction. And I seem to always give talks at the Penn Museum when it's raining, so at least this time it feels appropriate as opposed to just annoying. So we will be talking a lot about water and watery places today. And the reason for that is basically that 71% of the Earth's surface is covered in water. And so I think this is a really important thing for us to talk about. And the worlds that sort of exist beneath the surface of those watery places have really tantalized the imagination of human beings for millennia. Even today, biologists don't really have a handle on the variety of creatures that live in the depths of our oceans, rivers, lakes, and streams. Recently, they did a census of marine life, and they discovered more than 6,000 potential new ocean species in just under 10 years. So that gives you a sense of how many there are. Underwater worlds, kind of much like outer space, remain little explored and often deeply feared. For these reasons, it's kind of not surprising that almost all human societies have stories and beliefs about what might lurk beneath the surface of these watery places. So one of the most famous underwater dwellers is, of course, the Kraken, a legendary sea monster that is said to dwell off the coasts of Norway and Greenland and bring havoc to the lives of sailors through its dangerous tentacles and the whirlpools that it sort of leaves behind it in its wake. In Japanese mythology, the umibozu with its large human-like head, cloud-like torso, and serpentine limbs is said to live in the ocean and capsize sailors' ships. Likewise, in the swamps and riverbeds and creeks of Australia, they're thought to be haunted by the bunyip, a large and mythical creature that consumes animals and people who come near it during the night. Depictions of the bunyip vary quite wildly. Sometimes it's a creature with a horse-like tail, flippers, and a walrus-like tusk. Other times it's an oversized snake with a beard and a mane, or a huge furry half-human beast with a long neck and sometimes a bird-like head. So of course, none of these things sound pleasant to run into in a watery world, and particularly in a watery environment to which humans are not particularly well adapted. So when reading these myths and stories about creatures that dwell in these watery places, a couple of things stood out to me. I was struck by a couple of similarities. One is that there's a sense of danger and fear that seems to permeate our beliefs about beings that live underwater. Moreover, the beings themselves seem to exaggerate or combine the characteristics of a variety of more familiar creatures and become composite beings that are somehow wholly unfamiliar to us. So the question I want to explore in this talk is what lurks in our North American waters, and particularly what beings were thought to lurk there before Europeans arrived on this continent, bringing with them their beliefs from their sort of respective homelands. So to answer this question, I'm going to spend the first half of this talk giving you an introduction to what we know very broadly about the worldview of prehistoric Native American groups, particularly focused in the eastern United States. And then this will allow us to talk a bit about how the world was organized, what other than human creatures inhabited those various parts of the world, and how we as archaeologists actually learn about those creatures and get at such information. So then I'm going to give you an example of a story that we have come to understand quite well. And then finally, we'll sort of turn our attention to the underwater panther, one of the most interesting, in my opinion, but still very mysterious inhabitants of prehistoric Native American cosmos. Okay, so to get us started, archaeologists now agree, just to give you a little bit of, oops, we lost it. There we go. I guess I better be careful not to touch this. Archaeologists now agree that people were living in what is now the United States by between 14 and 15,000 years ago. They entered the New World probably through a variety of ways, likely either by walking across a land bridge that now sits under the Bering Strait, or by taking boats down the Pacific coast, and you can see those two things sort of drawn up there. They brought with them stories and beliefs about a world that formed the foundations of the belief systems that still permeate Native American belief systems today. Archaeologists and ethnohistorians recognize sort of remarkable similarities in the belief systems of indigenous groups throughout the Americas. For those of you who came to the Great Myths series last year, you may remember that Simon Martin and I gave a talk about the hero twins together. These are characters that loom large in both North and Mesoamerican lore. But that story was really only one example, and in fact there are a great number of similarities that allow us to hypothesize about just how ancient some of these belief systems are, including the fact that many of them likely came across with the very first people to populate this continent. So at first, I put kind of a chronology up here on the bottom, and at first during, which you can no longer see. All right, there we go. During what archaeologists call both the Paleo-Indian and the Archaic periods, the population levels in North America were very low, and people lived in small nomadic bands. They were hunting and gathering wild foods. They were passing on these stories to new generations around campfires, like in this artist's interpretation. But as the climate changed and these groups sort of adapted to this new environment that they found themselves in, population levels started to grow and distinct cultures began to form across the continent. As these groups spread out, they lost contact with one another, and they diversified their lifeways. The details of the original stories that were being told around those campfires morphed, and they gave rise to sort of the incredible variety of native traditions in the Americas today. So our ability, of course, as archaeologists to actually know anything about these stories relies on them being materialized either onto the landscape in the form of monuments or rock art, or onto artifacts in the form of figural or iconographic designs. So the first rock art in the United States was recently found in caves on Tennessee's Cumberland Plateau. These designs are over 6,000 years old and date to the middle of what we call the Archaic period. About 3,000 years ago, in the late Archaic, people living in northeast Louisiana, to zoom a little bit further south, built the incredible Poverty Point site. It has been said that the largest mound at Poverty Point is shaped like a bird with outstretched wings. That's sort of depicted up here in this map made of the Poverty Point site by an artist who's actually going to be involved in that exhibit that Steve mentioned. So erosion, of course, has made it very difficult to determine if this is in fact the case, if that mound is actually a bird. But the incredible stonework at this site suggests that birds were especially important to the Poverty Point people, so there's a reasonable chance that that's true. This site thus marks one of the first places where a really distinct iconographic focus can be identified, and where we as archaeologists can then start to piece together the stories from which these designs are likely being taken. So in the period that follows the Archaic, what we call the Woodland period, we see an explosion in this type of art, and particularly in the Middle Woodland from about 200 BC to AD 500. During this time, a huge trade network, which we call the Hopewell interaction sphere, develops. And this draws on materials such as obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, copper from the Great Lakes, and shell from the Gulf Coast. The center of this network, as you can see on this map, was in southern Ohio, where massive geometric earthworks, like the one that is depicted here at Newark, were associated with a very elaborate and beautiful range of material culture, which I've put some examples up here. There's still a strong focus on avian motifs, so bird motifs in Hopewell art and iconography, but many other themes also enter the suite of designs, showing up on materials like stone pipes and stone statues, on copper and mica cutouts, and on ceramic vessels. Just as a note for now, this includes possibly the earliest appearance of the underwater panther, which of course we'll look at in more detail later on. So soon after the Hopewell interaction sphere collapses, a new form of monumental figural art appears on the landscape of the upper Midwest. Well over 20,000 effigy mounds like these that are at Effigy Mounds National Monument in Iowa were constructed during the late Woodland period, so from about AD 600 to AD 1000. Approximately 4,000 of these exist today, and we have identified within that 4,000 mounds that were built in the shapes of birds, in the shapes of bears, lizards, turtles, humans, and then also panthers, which of course we're going to take a closer look at a little later on. So here it is important to note that we see many of the same creatures that played important roles in the symbolism of Hopewell people showing up in these later woodland effigy mounds that are much further to the west. And this kind of indicates that there really is a shared system of these foundational beliefs. So this pattern of shared motifs continues into the next period, into the Mississippian period, when we again see a real explosion of iconographic material. So during this period, major cities developed throughout the eastern United States, including Cahokia, which at its peak around AD 1050 was home to the largest prehistoric concentration of both people and monumental architecture north of Mexico. This was really an incredible place that was larger than the size of the city of London at the time. The people living in these cities created huge numbers of iconographic objects, which hopefully you'll be able to see. So more so than in earlier periods, we've really come as archaeologists to have a very deep understanding of Mississippian iconography, and particularly the repeated themes that sort of run throughout the figural materials that are present at a number of large Mississippian centers. So here's just a map of those Mississippian centers. The themes that we see at these places are really strong enough that scholars feel comfortable positing that the groups living at these sites shared a very closely related worldview and a set of stories about creatures that inhabited the universe with them. And this shared worldview has come to be called the Southeastern ceremonial complex in the archaeological literature. While materials related to this complex have been found from hundreds of sites throughout the Southeast and the Midwest, our understanding of it largely is based on some really incredible collections from 4 sites. Wait till that pops back up. So the sites that are the most common here are Cahokia in Illinois, Spiro over here in Oklahoma, Moundville in Alabama, and Etowah in Georgia. Here at the museum, we have some really incredible collections from Key Marco, and some of that stuff is on display right now in the Native American Voices Gallery. So I've been using, sort of throughout this presentation so far, I've been using the word iconography over and over and over again. And at this point, I want to be really clear about what archaeologists mean when they use this term. So by iconography, we mean the identification, description, and interpretation of the content of images as distinct from the artistic style in which they're rendered. So a good example of this is with these sort of modern religious symbols that I have up right now. Basically, it doesn't matter if I draw these in a very simple or a very stylized way. It doesn't matter if they're in black and white or if they're in color, or if they're drawn to look 3-dimensional or 2-dimensional. Basically, you know what they're symbolizing no matter what. When archaeologists study a particular culture's iconography, they are likewise looking past the style in which the object is sort of created, or the medium from which it was made, and instead really focusing on sort of the designs and motifs themselves. So On these three objects, one is made of shell, one is made of copper, and one is made of stone. And a number of iconographic motifs are also on display. I'll draw your attention to a few of them. So in the center here, we have the swastika or swirl cross. Here we have an oji figure sort of inside what looks like a sun. And here we have two intertwining rattlesnakes going around the edge of this stone disc. Hopefully you also note that on each of these there's a shared motif. There's this hand with an eye in its palm, human-looking hand, that's shared amongst all of them. In this case, a detailed study of the iconography of this sort of hand and eye motif would require sort of stepping back from the differences between these objects and focusing in on that one motif and really trying to make sense out of it. And this sort of work has been exactly the focus of an annual conference called the Mississippian Iconographic Conference, which has been held, there we go. All right, not gonna touch it. Has been held since 1992. The conference, interestingly, actually originally was modeled on a workshop that focused on reading Mayan hieroglyphs. So for those of you that are maybe more familiar with that part of the world, you can understand that this was basically an attempt to read these iconographic motifs in the same way that we're able to read those now. So each year, the members of the conference choose an iconographic motif to focus on. So for example, they may choose the hand and eye that I was just showing you. And then they pull every single example of that iconography from the corpus of archaeological materials that have been excavated, and they hang them on the walls of the room. And I put some pictures up. They're kind of secretive about it, so sorry these are such low quality. But you can see they've got sort of pieces of paper pasted up around the room, and then they take a few days to really spend a lot of time looking at them and trying to recognize the similarities and differences. And basically through this process, the conference participants have begun to actually more or less read the language of Mississippian iconography, and that reading is going to form the basis of a lot of what we're talking about tonight. Especially when sort of combined with ethnohistoric and ethnographic information, this study has decoded some of the myths and stories that are depicted on archaeological materials, much of which has been published in the 3 volumes that I just had up there. And just as a side note, if you guys are interested in learning more about this at the end of this talk, this volume over here called Hero, Hawk, and Open Hand is probably one of the most beautiful archaeological books I've ever seen. So I highly recommend taking that one up. It's written for a general audience, so it really makes it easy to understand and to learn a bit more. So what I would like to do now is basically give you a few examples of what we've learned about Mississippian iconography and the worldview that it represents. First, what I want to do is sort of lay out our basic understanding of how Mississippian people visualized the broader universe in which they existed. Then we're going to take sort of a quick spin through one of my favorite and fairly well understood stories, especially that is sort of depicted on these objects. And then finally, we're going to turn our attention for the latter half of this talk to the underwater panther himself. So to start off, we're going to explore the Mississippian cosmos through the use of this diagram. I promise this is going to be up on the screen for a long time, and we're going to go through it step by step, so you don't have to take it in right away. This diagram was designed by Kent Riley. He's one of the scholars who runs the conference that I just discussed. And of course, this is just an interpretation, but at the same time, all of the images that he used to create it are drawn directly from Mississippian iconographic objects. So he's not really adding his own voice as much as he is putting a bunch of pieces together into something that helps to tell the story as a whole. So I want to take you through this diagram sort of piece by piece, highlighting certain aspects of it, and then showing you objects on which the motifs actually appear in the archaeological record. So this entire diagram sort of relies on the idea that the cosmos consists of 3 layers. So I'm just going to highlight those 3 layers. The above world, the beneath world, and this world are the middle world. This world in green is sort of our world. It's the world of humans and most animals, the one we're walking around on today. And thus, images of human beings certainly occur regularly on Mississippian material culture. I have a few examples of those up there, as do animals. Here's just a few examples of animals showing up. This world is often depicted as floating on a watery underworld. That's the orange part down there. And the above world is seen sort of as the celestial vault or the sky. So this idea of a layered cosmos is really common throughout the Americas and really throughout the world. So we kind of believe that this layered cosmos, this series of 3 stacked worlds, may be one of the oldest aspects of this belief system. The above and beneath worlds are also inhabited by some animals, such as birds, fish, and serpents, but chiefly they're inhabited by supernatural beings, who I've highlighted now. So in the above world, there's the sun god. He often took the form of sort of a bird-human hybrid. And Mississippian leaders were often thought to draw their power from a connection to this individual through the regalia that they wore. So on Mississippian objects, we see both depictions of the sun god himself, and then also of humans that are sort of dressed up impersonating this god. These images are over here. On the other hand, when we look at the beneath world, the ruler is the underwater panther, a cat-like hybrid being that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about in a second. So these three Mississippian worlds are connected by this thing that I've highlighted in red. This is something that in the archaeological literature we call an axis mundi, something that we've borrowed from religious studies literature, basically translates to a world axis. Again, this is sort of a belief that permeates the religions of Native America, but in Mississippian iconography in particular, the axis mundi is represented as a tree or as a striped pole. And basically, in order to maintain balance and order in the world, it's necessary for humans to maintain relationships with the various inhabitants of these other worlds, and the axis mundi is basically what allows for that sort of communication between this world of the humans and the worlds above and beneath them. In addition, certain supernatural beings, including the underwater panther, sometimes could travel along it, allowing them to sort of move freely between the worlds and interact with humans in that way as well. So regardless of what world one existed in, the center of that world was always very important. And here I've just highlighted sort of the center symbols. No matter which world you're in, not only is it important, but it's also symbolized in a somewhat similar way. So if you're in this world, the center is symbolized by a simple cross. In the above world, by a cross with lobes surrounding it. And then in the beneath world, by a cross that swirls at the end, something that we call a swirl cross or a swastika. Thus, when one of these designs sort of shows up on an object, when it's drawn onto an object, it basically serves as a locative, allowing us to locate the story that's being told in one of the worlds. So if it has a swirl cross, we know that story is being told in the underworld, etc. This center symbol is shown on a number of iconographic objects currently on display here at the museum in Native American Voices. This is one of my favorites. This is the Mississippian shell gorget from the Key Marco site in Florida that I pointed out earlier. And these ethnographic objects from the Ute and Arapaho tribes sort of show the continued use of this cross motif in today's Native groups. So these are more recent. The four corners or the cardinal directions were also important in all worlds. So in this depiction, in the above world, the four directions are marked by bird spirits or thunderbirds. In this world, they're marked by those four serpents whose tails sort of extend down into the beneath world. They're kind of holding the floating world that we live on in place. And when we're looking at how this is depicted in iconography, I really like to point out these three shell gorgets that are over here on the side of this slide, because they really show just how similar the depictions of this sort of world can be. These are all found at highly different sites throughout the Southeastern ceremonial complex, both from different times and from different geographic areas. And so I think the similarities between them, with the swirls, with the four birds, with the cross in the middle, with the upper world symbol around it, these really show just how similar this belief system was across a very wide area. It shows just how widely shared it was. So in addition to depicting beliefs about the structure of the world and certain aspects of beings that live within it, sometimes the objects in this iconographic complex depict specific stories. And really quickly, I want to look at one example, the story of the Path of Souls, which is clearly depicted on the diagram that we've been using, which you can now see. The iconography associated with the Path of Souls is particularly common at the site of Moundville. That was one of those major Southeastern ceremonial complex sites that is located in Alabama. At this site, at one of these iconographic conferences, it was recognized that certain motifs were often being found together, namely the hand and eye motif, the depictions of skulls and bones, depictions of raptors, and depictions of a winged serpent. Once this group of associated motifs was identified, the same combination started to be identified at a number of other sites, so not just at Moundville. The argument for why this particular group of motifs is often found together, and sometimes even on the same ceramic vessels or on the same shell carvings, the argument is really that they represent Native beliefs about what happens to the human soul after its death. So this is a case where archaeologists' interpretation of the iconography has really been helped and supported by what we know about these groups ethnographically. There is huge variation, of course, in the stories that are told by Native groups, both today and in the past, but the fact that the soul of an individual who has died travels the path of the Milky Way is something that sort of unites a lot of these stories. So now what I want to do is just take you through that story with the help of images created by George Langford, who's another participant in the iconographic conference. So we're just going to go through this story. The path of souls leads to the west towards the setting sun, and it is believed that a soul can only make it onto the path by crossing between the worlds at one specific point in the sky, which in Mississippian iconography takes the shape of a hand with a portal between the worlds being sort of represented as the eye within that palm. So we're coming back to that hand and eye motif. Given both astronomical data and our knowledge about the beliefs of contemporary Native people, the hand is thought to be represented by the current constellation of Orion, and it has been suggested that perhaps the portal itself is the Orion Nebula, or what is referred to in some stories as the fuzzy star, which exists within this constellation. In most iterations of the story, the portal is not always open, meaning that you cannot always enter the Path of Souls. In fact, it can only be accessed on certain days of the year. If you ask Native groups today, in most ethnographic cases, these days are during the winter and the early spring, which actually corresponds really well to the dates of November 29th through April 25th, which is when the Hand constellation, when Orion touches the western horizon, sort of reaches down during the night and touches the western horizon, but never disappears below it. So this actually makes a lot of sense as a time when you might be able to enter through that portal. So a successful leap from this world into the above world through this portal puts the soul onto the Milky Way. And how different Native groups describe the path it takes once it's there really varies, but there are a few common elements, and I want to sort of focus on those common elements here. So the human soul invariably passes through a variety of challenges on its path. It doesn't just have an easy path once it gets on there. It's tested by a variety of creatures along the path, and it's at these locations that the soul's successful passage to the afterlife really relies. One of these places is where the Milky Way forks. At this fork, the soul is tested by a supernatural that's often depicted as some sort of raptor-like creature. Astronomers tell us that there actually is a place where the Milky Way forks, with one path leading sort of to a dead end, you can see that drawn on right here, and the other one continuing on to the other horizon. This fork in the Milky Way aligns perfectly with the constellation of Cygnus, or the Northern Cross, right here. And in almost all cultures, this constellation is viewed as a bird in flight, which aligns really well with the Mississippian idea that an avian creature sort of guards this auspicious point along the Path of Souls. One really interesting detail that came out of this iconographic conference is that this split in the Milky Way may actually be depicted on some Mississippian objects, such as this copper cutout down here, which you can see sort of leads from the portal, from the hand and eye, towards the above world symbol here. But the arm itself forks just above the wrist. So we think that that might be what's being represented here. So at the end of its journey along the Milky Way, near the eastern horizon, the soul finally reaches the winged serpent. This is the end of the path at our constellation of Scorpius. Many Native cultures, of course, see this constellation as a winged serpent rather than a scorpion. There's nothing that makes it particularly a scorpion, but it does have this sort of very unique tail or wing motif. Many Native cultures see this sort of bird-like figure, this winged serpent-like figure, and it basically is thought to symbolize the end or the culmination of the soul's journey when it's successfully made it into the afterlife. So we thus know how to interpret certain symbols in Mississippian iconography through our understanding of sort of the overall worldview, and then we know how to interpret others through our understanding of specific stories. But undoubtedly, as is the case with most iconographic writing systems, there's still a lot that we don't understand. And so with that, I want to turn our attention from the relationship between this world and the above world to our relationship with the mysterious beneath world. Whereas in the above world, you can enter it through a portal in the heavens, the beneath world is accessed through caves, lakes, springs, whirlpools, and other watery places. And the ruler of this domain is, as I said before, the underwater panther. The underwater panther is a supernatural being called by many different names in today's woodlands and plains Indian groups. And likewise, the underwater panther is depicted iconographically in a variety of ways, generally possessing attributes of both a panther and a serpent, and often depicted with horns and sometimes with wings. The underwater panther was sometimes viewed as a very dangerous creature that created waves and whirlpools with its long thrashing tail, and then at other times it was viewed as a harbinger of danger that could also provide protection if treated appropriately. It regularly appears in various myths and stories as a challenger faced by humans along journeys of conquest and exploration, and as a protector who's reached only through dreams and vision quests and with appropriate sacrifices. So the first iconographic indications of the underwater panther appear in the Middle Woodland Hopewell period, throughout the area that was encompassed by that large interaction sphere that we looked at earlier. Here we have images from Missouri, Ohio, Texas, and Indiana. And this particular set of images hints at some of the difficulties that people studying prehistoric iconography face when they're dealing with a group of objects like this. So for example, in some cases, particularly this one here in the bottom right corner, we have a clearly identifiable panther figure. So there, looks like a cat, but at the same time, it has nothing that specifically indicates that it's an underwater panther. On the other hand, in the bottom left image over here, we've got a clearly supernatural creature that's very likely associated with the underworld based on a number of its characteristics, but it has only peripherally panther-like features. So when left with just these two things get a little complicated, but luckily other objects more clearly combine the features of the underwater world with those of the panther to really make the case that this particular character of the underwater panther has taken clear shape in native stories by this time. And the best example of this is this shell gorget up here on the top right corner, where the panther figure is seen opposite the thunderbird figure, which would be its opposing force in the above world. So sort of drawing on that broad cosmology that we looked at before. So in the subsequent late Woodland period, just after the Hopewell interaction sphere is collapsing, panther effigy mounds appear throughout the upper Midwest. And this really suggests that this particular creature is kind of here to stay in the myths of Eastern Native American groups. Echoing what we've been able to figure out regarding Mississippian cosmology, Oneota groups, who probably would have been the ones creating these mounds, were separated into three clan systems. Sky clans were usually represented by birds, earth clans were represented by humans and bears, and water clans were represented by panthers and serpents. So as seen on this map over here on the far side, birds, bears, and panthers are all very common, and we usually use those to sort of talk about the variety of mounds. But they're spatially segregated on the landscape in a really interesting way. So about 80% of all bear and bird effigies are over here in southwest Wisconsin in sort of hillier, more upland part of the state. And then more than 90% of all panther effigies, these guys over here, are located in the lowland southeast, often situated directly next to watery environments such as rivers and lakes. And then in addition to being sort of purposefully situated next to bodies of water, the ethnographic data from the area, particularly Ho-Chunk oral tradition, says that the tails of panther effigy mounds specifically pointed to underground springs and other entrances to the underworld. So a further connection between panther effigies and water is this panther intaglio located in Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin. Intaglios are basically like the opposite of mounds, where native people actually dug out dirt and removed it to create a sunken version of an effigy rather than sort of building it up to create a mound. 10 of these were recorded in the mid-1800s. They're very rare, and the vast majority that were recorded were in fact panthers. We have absolutely no idea how many native existed originally. You can tell in this picture how hard these things might be to identify. But this one here in Fort Atkinson is the only one that remains visible today. As you can see in this old picture of it, it's also situated right here next to a watery environment. And given how close it is to the water table, it's typical that these fill up during the wet season with water on a fairly regular basis, making a very visible and very clear connection between the panther form and the underwater world. So before moving on to Mississippian historic period accounts of the underwater panther, I have to take a little bit of time to show you this guy, who is my favorite artifact here in the Penn Museum. I talk about him all the time. much to the dismay of some of my students, I think. But at almost exactly the same time that those Panther effigy mounds are being built in the upper Midwest, this Jasper boatstone is being carved in the lower Mississippi Valley. While this object is not currently on display, we will be putting it up in that show that Steve mentioned, which opens at the end of June. So I really hope that you guys will come back and pay him a visit when he sort of finally emerges from his sub-basement lair, which is where he has been for a very long time here at that museum. This piece, along with this really spectacular effigy pipe, which is currently on display in the Native American Voices Gallery, were found in 1852 at the Feltus site in Jefferson County, Mississippi. I did my dissertation research at this site from 2006 to 2012. This is an old depiction of the site there. And we basically, while we were digging there, found sort of independent evidence that Feltus was an important location for human people communicating with beings in other worlds. Over the course of a few hundred years, a series of very large standing posts were ceremonially erected and then removed as part of huge public feasts and burial rituals. And we believe that these posts basically represented the axis mundi, or the world axis that's so commonly depicted in Mississippian iconography. And also that the presence of special objects such as this underwater panther effigy and this pipe indicate that Feltus posts basically served as locations where humans in this world could communicate with supernatural beings that were inhabiting the above and beneath worlds, thereby sort of maintaining the essential order and balance in the universe. So after AB 1000, at the outset of the Mississippian period, the number of underwater panther depictions in the archaeological records skyrockets. It's not going to be possible for me to show you every example of Mississippian underwater panthers that I've come across, but what I am going to do is sort of show you the different categories of material that this creature is depicted on. The first are these open bowls, where the panther occurs as what we call a rim rider, so basically he's riding the rim of the bowl. We have one of these in our collection, this little guy down here. He's no longer attached to his bowl, but we have the rim rider part. It was found in a mound in Washita Parish, Louisiana, that was also actually collected by the same man who collected the underwater panther boatstone from Feltus in the 1850s. So hopefully you can see on these images that there are a lot of similarities in the way that this creature is depicted on these bowls. Often it has large, pointed, nasty-looking teeth. It has markings around its eyes and its mouth, and it has a curly tail. In the center, on sort of the bottom of the slide here, you can also see that the markings on the face are clearly elaborated into the telltale sort of swirled cross motif on the side of the vessel, probably a clear indication that this is associated with the underworld. This swirl pattern becomes quite characteristic of a variety of other underwater panther vessels, these guys up here that are painted in red and white, and often stand up on sort of four clawed feet. Again, on all of these representations, sharp teeth and eye and mouth markings appear on many of the examples. These same characteristics then appear on stone effigy pipes that are also from the Mississippian period. Often these were referred to as cat monster pipes. A lot of people now call them underwater panther pipes. And these features feature the same types of stylized facial markings that we were seeing on those pots. Pipe smoking was and remains an incredibly important thing to Native Americans, and particularly to the ritual practice of communication between the worlds. In most cases, it's viewed as sort of a means of communication via the smoke that rises to the heavens, and via the roots of the tobacco plants that grow deep into the earth. So it's possible that these cat monster pipes were specifically created to open lines of communication with the underworld. And then finally, within Mississippian iconography, underwater panthers also show up on a variety of other materials, and particularly in copper and on shell, both of which, if you think about it, are very logical media for depictions of this creature because of their clear associations with water as a source of raw material, so shell from the Gulf Coast and copper, which almost entirely came from the Great Lakes. Most of the depictions of the underwater panther on shell in particular come from the site of Spiro in Oklahoma, and they often depict the beast as having some human-like in addition to cat-like characteristics, as in the sort of top right and bottom left images, this one here, and this guy's head down here. So whether depicted in clay, in stone, in copper, or in shell, we have no doubt that the underwater panther played a major role in Mississippian belief systems. But the question becomes, how can we start to understand the specific stories that may have been told in a way similar to how we understand the path of souls? We're not as far along, to be completely honest, in the process with this character, but I do want to share a bit about what we've learned and how we're progressing so far. So ethnohistoric accounts of the Muskogee, who live in Tennessee, Georgia, and Alabama, report a Wakacha, or a water panther, who played a primary role in the destruction of the Muskogee mother town of Coosa. In this story, the Wakacha mated with a human woman and produced hybrid children. It's possible that this is an aspect of the story that is being depicted on these artifactual examples that show panthers with human-like characteristics as well. The story goes that the children of this union were disliked by the townspeople, they were scared of them, and their lives were threatened. When the woman reported this threat to the water panther, he told her to ask those that were sympathetic to her cause, that were willing to protect her children, to go far from the town, and then proceeded to flood the town using his power, so that a lot of the rest of the people died. There's now sort of said in this community that there was a great whirlpool on this site of the old town, and that even birds are scared to fly across it lest they might get sucked in. In many other Southeastern tribes, whirlpools mark clear and dangerous points of contact between this world and the beneath world, so this story really fits in well in that case. Usually these whirlpools are guarded by powerful underwater creatures, and quite often they have cat and sometimes serpent-like characteristics. So though we do have these couple clear mentions of cat-like aquatic creatures in the southeast, most of the ethnohistoric evidence of the underwater panther actually comes from further north. So what we're going to do now is sort of wind our way northward via the meandering rivers and streams of the eastern woodlands. So in 1673, Jacques Marquette reported that he and fellow French explorer Louis Joliet discovered a painting of two water monsters on a bluff overlooking the Mississippi River between its confluences with the Missouri and the Illinois rivers. This 1678 sketch here was created from the written description in Marquette's journal, which read, and I'll quote this, "They are as large as a calf. They have horns on their heads like those of a deer, a horrible look, red eyes, a beard like a tiger's, a face somewhat like a man's, a body covered with scales, and so long a tail that it winds all around the body, passing above the head and going back between the legs, ending in a fish's tail." This description shares, of course, many of the characteristics with the underwater panther depictions from the southeast, and clearly combines the features of a land-based and a water-dwelling creature. A while after this initial discovery, it was recorded in ethnohistoric accounts that in local legend, members of the Miami tribe from that region had drowned in the exact place where these were drawn while being pursued by warriors from a tribe just to the north. It was said that at the time of the conversation that was recorded in this ethnohistoric account, many hundred years later, that the people still went to that rock and smoked tobacco as an offering to the two beasts, which they called Paisaw, that lived in the waters there. This 1839 illustration from a German book actually shows two of these creatures on the bluff, so that fits with that depiction. In the years that followed, it was said that native travelers would do things like discharge their weapons at the images as they passed, which eventually led to their degradation, and they were nearly invisible by 1700. Sadly, for that reason, we do not know exactly when the initial mural was created. It could have been as early as AD 1000 or as late as the 1600s. But we do know that the word Paisaw derives from the Algonquian-speaking Illinois people who occupied the area at contact. Later, ethnohistoric accounts of contact with this tribe describe the Paisaw as having the body of a panther with 4 legs, sometimes a human head, and always with horns and an exceptionally long tail. This fits very well. A panther is actually one of the longest-tailed animals that exists in the world, with its tail making up about 1/3 of its total body length. So as a child growing up in St. Louis, Missouri, I actually remember stopping along the Great River Road bike trail with my family to sort of gaze up at this modern recreation of that creature. It's gone through quite a number of iterations at the time, and I put a couple of the older ones down here. This is the one that's up currently. And as you can see, it's painted on the rock, maintaining its sort of horns, its tail, and its cat-like features, but it's been given the talons and the wings of a bird, which likely has to do with the fact that eagles are incredibly important in the region today. They're sort of drawing on that iconography. We don't have any evidence that those were there originally. So perhaps our best understanding of the underwater panther actually makes us move just a little bit further north, and comes from the central Algonquian tribes, and particularly from the Ojibwe of Quebec and eastern British Columbia, who believed that the beneath world was ruled by a powerful cat-like creature called the Mishivishu. When explorers first recorded stories about this creature, they described it in quite a variety of ways, as a great panther, as a great tiger, as a huge brown cat, and my favorite, as a sea tiger on which they put fins. But the term translates literally in the Ojibwe language to great lynx. While the descriptions of this creature definitely vary, they always combine characteristics of cats and reptiles, and they include horns, a significant sign of power in Ojibwe culture across the board. They're often also depicted with a spiny back and huge tail, which can pretty clearly be seen in this rock art from Ontario. This rock art is tentatively attributed to an Ojibwe shaman who was compelled by a vision to undertake the long voyage from the south shore of Lake Superior up to Battle Rock in Ontario, where he met the underwater panther along the way. In Ojibwe lore, Mishigishu is said to rule the underworld and all underground and underwater creatures. This means that he controls game animals, and particularly can take away or provide fish from hunters depending on his mood and what those hunters might have done to appease him. This placement on the rock here is clearly in a very watery environment, so this seems to support this conclusion. And then he's also depicted immediately beside this pictograph of a canoe. There we go, a pictograph of a canoe with people in it, probably fishermen, perhaps indicating that this one particular place is a place where humans may come in contact with this dangerous beast. So creatures with similar characteristics and similar native names are actually noted in 10 or so separate tribal traditions, focused largely in sort of the northern mid-continent, but also extending a bit into the Great Plains and into the Northeast as well. They appear in widely dispersed rock art with characteristic spines, horns, and long tails, indicating a fairly consistent conception of the appearance of this creature across a huge variety of tribal groups. In these more northern areas, the underwater panther is seen as the hidden form beneath the ice that causes the surface to crack dangerously in the winter. He's also seen as the creature beneath the surface that pulls boaters and swimmers to their deaths in the summer. So he's thus a really dangerous being and serves as sort of a central figure in myths of these societies that explain the origins of death and the afterlife. Similar images of the underwater panther also permeate the more portable material culture of these tribes. These objects up here are all closely associated with power, both physical power and spiritual power, and would be considered dangerous but very useful sources of knowledge if you knew how to best utilize them to sort of communicate between the worlds. Two of the objects here, this feather box down here on the bottom, and then this club here from Wisconsin, are currently on display in the Native American Voices Gallery, and they show underwater panthers sort of interacting with other creatures from the Native American cosmos. So the underwater panther is right there on the feather box, and there's two of them up here at the top of this club. Perhaps most commonly in more recent Native American material culture, underwater panthers are depicted on these charm bags. On this slide, I've put up 3 common methods of creating the designs. The ones on the left are corded with wool yarn, the ones in the center are quilled, and the ones on the right are beaded. This focus of depicting underwater panthers on charm bags is likely related to another myth in which they figure very prominently and has been recorded in Ethnohistoric record. This myth explains the origins of certain medicine societies and starts at a deep spring-fed pool near Lake Erie. Because apparently of the mysterious and unusual movements of the water in this location, Native people living in the area shunned the pool as the home of an evil water spirit. They basically didn't go anywhere near it. But one day, a huge light flashed above the pool and the ground sort of thundered and moved, and a small party from a local Wyandotte community decided to camp at the spring, determined that they were finally going to learn about the mysterious creature lurking in the water. While they camped, they threw many valuable objects into the spring to try and lure it out, and they burnt tobacco as offerings to the creature. And soon all sorts of creatures started to rise from the pool, and the very last was a white panther. When he saw the panther, the leader of this party pierced its side with an arrow and collected the blood that flowed from the wound. Only when the collecting pan was filled did the panther resubmerge itself in a great rumbling and another huge flash of light. So based on this experience, it's said that the men who witnessed the panther formed a secret society and distributed small amounts of the coagulated blood for each member to carry around in their medicine bags and use only when they especially needed good luck, either in the hunt, on the warpath, or in their healing exploits. This story in particular really emphasizes that the power of the underwater panther is not wholly evil, but when treated appropriately and appeased can provide protective powers to those who respect it. So before I end, I would just like to emphasize the presence of contemporary native and non-native art as well. So this slide shows some of the underwater panthers that are depicted in sort of a variety of contemporary media. The bottom left is perhaps one of the most famous contemporary depictions of the underwater panther by Anishinaabe artist Blake Devasage. This depiction was inspired, he says, by the near drowning of his brother, showing that the danger associated with the underwater panther still really permeates the belief systems of contemporary Native American people today. Michael Belmore, he created this one in the middle. He's an Ojibwe artist, and this piece basically shows the Mishipishu submerged full of a beaver, and he says that this is an example of nature's ability to persevere in the face of adversity. Non-native artists have also created underwater panther-based art, such as this piece over here by Mark Heil. It's actually a friend of my father's, which he placed on his property in Missouri to protect what he views as a highly sacred Native American site that's being threatened by development near the confluence of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. I put up a few other examples. This one is a film storyboard. Sadly, it does not appear that the film was ever made. So clearly the dangerous and protective roles of underwater panthers are taken seriously by even people outside of the Native communities. A fact perhaps most amusingly shown by this beer, which was created by a brewery in Cedarburg, Wisconsin. I stumbled across this. You learn really important things when you're researching a talk. The description, it'll come back up. There you go. The description on their website, I just wanted to read you that, says, the underwater panther is a powerful mythological creature of Native American lore. A malevolent beast, it lives in deep water and needs to be appeased for safe passage across a lake. Its power, size, and elusiveness make it the perfect namesake for our American double IPA. If you catch a glimpse of this creature, take care to pacify it, lest it pull you under. So clearly this has kind of permeated outside of Native belief systems and into sort of popular culture as well. So just to conclude, sort of regardless of the specifics of these stories, the underwater panther in all of its various iterations seems to share in sort of a worldwide tendency to believe in mythical creatures that are extraordinary, whether in size or appearance. Often they have parts that have been exaggerated, misshapen, or forged together from sort of multiple species. And then always they possess great power, while sometimes offering great danger. I'm sure that many of you sort of came to this talk thinking that cats and water generally do not go together at all. And as a cat owner, I definitely agree with that. But what I hope that I've done in this talk is sort of make the case that it's this exact incongruence, this idea that through unusual combinations, creatures somehow become something kind of wholly unlike anything else that we will ever meet. That incongruence actually plays into the same tradition of many of the world's great beasts, including many of the ones that you've probably heard about during other talks, and you will hear about in the rest of this series. So with that, I will leave up this beautiful image of the underwater, and I'm happy to take some of your questions.
So those fantastic Mississippian effigy vessels and soapstone carvings, what kinds of archaeological contexts were they found? Were they mortuary?
So a lot of them are in mortuary contexts, but not all. Sadly, a huge number of Mississippian sites were looted prior to the point where we were doing a lot of archaeological investigations. So for example, the ones that we have in our collection here were collected from sites where we have very little records. On the other hand, at certain sites, particularly Spiro and Moundville, they have been excavated from burial contexts. Moundville, at the latter end of its life cycle, basically became a necropolis. People stopped living there and they started only burying people there. And Spiro was an enormous elite burial mound. So a lot of the ones that are from those two sites came from burial contexts. However, we have found them in just sort of normal domestic contexts, but not nearly as frequently, and particularly not whole. Often when we find whole vessels, those are the ones that are coming from burial contexts. Go ahead.
I was just amazed about the shaped mounds. Could you say more about them? How are they made? And some of them are covered in grass now.
Yeah.
So fabulous.
Yeah, absolutely. So there, as I said, we estimate that there were probably 20,000 of these mounds, basically focused in southern Wisconsin, a little bit in northern Illinois, a little bit across the border into Iowa. But these were highly concentrated in one particular place, and they were all built by process. Actually, all these mounds that we talked about today were built by a process of basket loading. So basically, no metal tools existed at this time, and what people would do is they would use digging sticks, and they would dig dirt out of things we call borrow pits, large pits. They'd fill up baskets, and they'd carry those baskets one by one and dump them in particular locations to build up the mounds. One of the things that I think is the most amazing about these, so some mounds are much larger. The Monk's Mound at Hopewell, the largest mound in North America, is about the size of a 10-story building. So people were really capable of remarkable feats of engineering. But what's most amazing about these effigy mounds to me is that on the ground, it's very hard to tell what they are. And these people didn't have airplanes. They didn't have drones to help them see it. And so what's incredible to me is the sort of visual that they were able to get of what something may look like from above, that they could create these enormous, incredible effigy mounds. Really shows not only incredible artistic ability, but incredible engineering ability as well. And then to answer your last question, now they're covered in grass, largely because that's the most effective way that we have to maintain them. At the time, they may have grown up, but likely they were actually kept uncovered. They were probably dirt colored because grass, they didn't have lawnmowers. They wouldn't be able to keep it nice and easy to mow. They didn't even have animals like goats or anything that might consume the grass. So probably they were keeping it dirt colored, and it's just now that we've started to visualize these things as being covered in grass.
Hello? Yes, can you talk a little bit about Mesoamerican Panther ideology and its similarities and differences from the Mississippian stuff?
So only a little bit. I wish I don't have Simon here. Simon would do a better job, I'm sure, than I would. So there are a lot of similarities, and this is actually something that I think would be really interesting for me to look into a little bit further, because especially of particular cases in which we know the same stories are being told in Mesoamerica and South America. So there's one really complicated answer to this that I'll try and do a good job of explaining. I really focused on this talk on the panther and the underwater form of this particular creature, but we do think that it is very closely related to the sort of winged serpent in the above world, that basically they were an above and lower world version of the same creature. And so the feathered serpent in Mesoamerica is also likely a big part of this story, and they're sort of playing similar roles. So in some cases, the panther is actually one of the widest ranging mammalian species in North America. It basically, at one point, seemed to have existed from the Straits of Magellan all the way up to sort of the northern reaches of Canada, right before you sort of hit the Arctic. So there's certainly panther figures that exist everywhere, and what we're at the stage of figuring out is just how related the stories between them are. And they're certainly viewed as dangerous creatures. There's also often taboos against consuming them, so they're not game animals as much as they are sort of ritually important animals, and those things certainly seem to permeate all of sort of North Meso and South America, actually. But the details of the stories, just because we don't have them as well worked out in North America as they have them in Mesoamerica, we don't really know yet. But my hope is that as the iconography of Mississippian times sort of gets better understood and we do more ethnohistoric research on panthers, that we'll be able to make very specific ties to Mesoamerican stories and maybe try and determine to what degree some of those stories repeat in North America. I think that they may actually provide some of those explanations for us.